Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It is Monday, January 9th, 2017. The reason why I chose to do this webinar tonight is because I was just in New York this past week, and I was invited to speak to a community that had recently had experienced a death because of opioid overdose, an opiate overdose in their community. And so it was something that they wanted to have somebody come out and talk to and have a dialogue, learn about prevention, because for this particular community, I think they thought they were exempt from this problem, and it was not going to get into their community, and it's something that is now ravaging the community and several communities around them. So I thought I'll take that experience, both the preparation of the talk, but also the dialogue that I had around that experience, and I'll present that to you tonight. So that's what I'm bringing to you tonight. There are some ideas and principles from other webinars. Specifically, one that I drew upon heavily was the 8 tips for successful communication, or excuse me, for healthy relationships webinar that I've done, and because it's one that it's going to apply, of course, to this kind of discussion. So let's get right into it. The first piece that I started off with was this idea of shame. In August of 2014, when the comedian and actor Robin Williams took his own life, I was asked to speak on a radio show, and at the time there was a lot of dialogue amongst my colleagues, amongst people in pop culture, about what was the cause of his suicide, his death. And he was an outspoken person in terms of his own difficulties with drug abuse and use, and in recovery, and he was very vocal in recovery, and also had shared with many people of his problems with depression. And so there was discussions like, which one did it? Was it the depression, or was it the drug addiction that killed him? And one of my friends and colleagues, I think, answered it best. And he said it was the shame that killed him. Because you can treat substance abuse and you can treat mood disorder. But if you're so ashamed that you're not going to reach out for help, if you're afraid of being a failure, being a burden, being a problem, struggling, causing loved ones to suffer because you suffer, and so you keep all of that inside, then suicide is the ultimate out, the ultimate escape. It is the ultimate shrinking, and shame is a feeling of shrinking. So first and foremost, one of the things that we need to do in our families and in our communities is increase the dialogue with mental health and addiction. The more open that we can talk about it, the more we can talk about it. One of the things that I said to the community last night was this idea that if you're waiting to have the perfect thing to say, the perfect discussion with your child or with your loved one around drug abuse, drug use, and addiction, then it's going to be too late. It's okay to stumble into it, to stutter into it, and to do it wrong. And so what we want is just to increase the dialogue. And you'll learn as you go. You'll learn as you go. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of there were so many questions last night about what do you say in this situation? What do you say to them if you suspect it? What do you say to them if you suspect that their legal consumption of alcohol is becoming a problem? If you have a loved one in that situation, what do you say? And the challenge that I had when being asked that question as part of the Q&A panel last night was, it's not about what you say, it's about how you listen. It's the dialogue that you create. And the most important thing, and I might not underscore anything on this webinar more than this, the most important thing is developing ears to listen, the ability to listen. I use the example from Marilyn Manson, the shock rocker, the shooters, the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre were said to be fans of his, and actually were listening to his music on the morning before they planned and executed their plan at Columbine High School. And so when Marilyn Manson was being interviewed subsequently, he was asked the question, what would you have said to them if you could have talked to them before then? And Marilyn Manson said, I wouldn't have said anything, I would have listened. So we start to see the idea, because we know that the problems in mental health and addiction specifically are about disconnection, feeling alienated, isolated, not connected, and that drugs may in fact be that attempt to get that same kind of feeling when we have when we feel understood and connected, that the antidote to it is to learn to listen. I had a parent recently that was in the initial stages of our program, and he was asking me the question about the first letter, and we were talking about what his goals were for his son being in our program, his young adult son. And he said, I just want him to be in a place where he can hear all of the wisdom, all from my own experience that I have to offer to him. And I said to him gently, that's not going to be the most important stuff. The most important stuff is going to be what he discovers about himself in this process therapeutically. The most important thing that you can do in this process is develop a capacity to listen. And I think for many of us parents, and you can imagine very easily for me also, that we are challenged by this concept, that we first often seek to lecture or to teach rather than asking and listening without judgment. In my book, I talk about this next example. I talk about the Marilyn Manson example and also the Adam and Eve example, where right after they took the forbidden fruit in the story in Genesis, the first thing that happened to them is they were told by the serpent that they were naked and that they should hide, cover themselves up and hide from God. And I think this story is a fantastic metaphor for shame. It is shame. The voice is saying your nakedness, meaning your humanness, who you are, without any defense or pretense, is unacceptable. It's the opposite of the divine. And so you need to cover it up and hide. That's shame. And of course, when God came looking for them in this story in Genesis, he said, who said you were naked? What are you talking about? And they said, the serpent, the story. So I think that it goes back to this idea that one of the ways that we can have a countermeasure to shame is grace, right? Where there is grace, shame will not survive. And grace is an undeserved love, an undeserved acceptance. And I'm not talking about condoning what somebody does, saying the action that you committed, the thing that you did was okay or good. I'm saying that we come at it from a much more compassionate place. And when we start to understand that these mental health issues and also that addiction is a brain disease instead of a moral failing, we can more easily do that. And when we can show up in the lives, and addicts make it very hard. Drug abusing people make it very difficult. Children that are struggling with behavioral mental health problems make it challenging to love them, to not be angry, not be frustrated. And that's why we go and we do our work, so that we build up our capacity so that we can show up in that way. On several occasions, including last night, I've been hired to really do prevention work. What can we do to prevent our child needing to come to your program, needing to go to a program, getting into trouble with substances in this case or other issues? And as I thought about this, it's really the same work. The prevention work is the same as the treatment. We learn to talk. We learn to figure out what's going on inside. And through that process, and the process that gets facilitated around that for a family, we create in the individual a sense of okayness, a sense of well-being, a sense of acceptance. And that's the best antidote. That's really what happens in AA meetings and Cocaine's Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous and Sex and Love Addictions Anonymous. That's what it is you go in there, you tell your despicable story, your true, honest, horrible story, and you're welcomed with open arms, without judgment. You're invited to be there. And so that's the healing that comes in this work. And that's what we can do more of and help our children. I don't think denial is as applicable to this group because you're in it. But the reason I brought up denial is because there are really two ways to address this. You can address it from an ideological place, and you might have a different ideology, right? It might be about good and bad, right and wrong. You can try to apply that with regards to substance abuse or mental health problems. or you can do a pragmatic approach. What works? So often when I'm treating a family, treating an individual who's struggling with substance abuse or substance addiction or mental health, so often I have to explain to the parents, look, we're going toward the same place, but we're going to try to get there a different way. I have some different ideas about how to get there. And it's not going to be through fear. It's not going to be through anger and intimidation. It's not going to be through power. It's going to be through this love and acceptance. And if you play the long game, if you're in it for the long game, and I think all parents are, we know that to work much more effectively. It's hard to play the long game when your child's in crisis. It's hard to play the long game when your child has already participated in behaviors and actions that are potentially life-threatening. And so sometimes you absolutely have to take the kind of steps that all of you took to get your child into treatment. That's a truism. And once that happens, you can start to go back to the long game and say, I'm going to get there indirectly. I'm going to get there in a way that is counterintuitive. Instead of lecturing, I'm going to listen. Instead of giving the answer, I'm going to share my own problems. The example that I've given and I gave last night is share your struggles. Give examples of your self-medicating behavior and how challenging it is for you. It might not be drugs, might not be alcohol, might be work, might be your smartphone, might be watching TV, watching sports, exercise. It could be a lot of other things. But when you start to share your struggles and challenges, they fill in the gap. When you create this vacuum of a solution. In other words, you can provide the solution to your child and give them your lectures, or you can just present your own empathic response by saying, I struggle in similar areas, not exactly the same, but in similar ways. What gets filled up in that vacuum is the child's, the other person's ideas for the solution. So instead of you giving them the lecture, the brain automatically goes to filling in that blank space with their own idea, their own lecture. You know, this is the key is not what you're going to say. It's learning to listen. That's why I talk about it's new ears and new eyes. I was visiting with a rabbi here who, if you're Jewish and you want to look at it, it's I think his website is Jewish Utah. It's Rabbi Benny Zippel, and he has this heart project that he reaches out to the children in Utah that are Jewish whose families ask. And he visits them in all kinds of treatment centers all over Utah. It's one of the many things that he does. And I was asking him about this. I was asking him about, what's it like for you? What do you think is the most important thing? And he said to me the same thing. He said, I just go in and listen. And I said, how do they react to you? How do the adolescents react to you? The young adults react to you when you visit? And he said, a good percentage of the time they're angry. He said, they often see in my face the face of their parents. Right? I'm the institution that they're rebelling against and fighting against. And I said, what do you do with that? And he said, I honor it. I'm okay with it. I want them to talk about their anger. And I want to listen and understand. And I was so happy, so thrilled that he had that perspective. That's a very sophisticated idea, concept, and very difficult to execute as a parent. That's why sometimes our children do better with other adults than with us. True for me, true for you. Because other people can listen to the anger more. And if the anger is directed at us, it can be especially challenging to listen to. But we want our children to talk about their feelings. This stuff is a disease of feelings, among other things, right? It's an inability to tolerate reality. And so they ingest chemicals, they escape through their symptomology to feel something else, to feel something different. So I think that's a powerful example, and I was excited to see that he had adopted it. I was talking to another friend just prior to my talk on Sunday night in New York, and when I was talking to him, he was talking about several people in the community that he had received treatment in, and he said that several of the young men, because some of them were young adult men that he was in treatment with, although this friend of mine was my age, he said, so many times I heard them say something like, I could never talk about this with my father or my mother. They would shut it down. They would have a reaction to it. that I would immediately have to stop talking about it or take care of them. And think about that. If we want to be part of the solution, and that's really what we're inviting you all to do, is to be a part of the solution. We want to give the family a different way of being with each other so that you carry that long after Evoke. And in the last week, I did a parent group for the Evoke parents on Wednesday night, and then I had the speaking engagement last night. And constantly, people keep asking me at our parent meeting and at the large group that I spoke to last night, they keep asking me, what do you say? Just like I said earlier in the webinar, what do you say? And my response was, it's a dialogue. The first thing I ask is, what's going on? And then I take it from there, right? So it's learning how to be in a different relationship. Two parents at the parent meeting, when sharing in their opening introductions, had that question, like, I want to know how to be with my children, my son in one case, my daughter in another case, in a way that's helpful and supportive to her. And I said, that's the right question. But I can't answer the question, what do you say? Because I'm not going to come in there with my speech, my agenda, impose it and impose it on her. I'm going to come in there with questions and ideally with curiosity. And I'm going to listen, and it's going to develop from there. Having said that, having talked about this idea that I talk about with this new sensibility, this new way of being, and that's really what therapy helps us to do, is to discover our most authentic self, to be a self. And when we become that self, we then enter into relationships in a much different way. Tools can change you. These are somewhat related to the 8 tips for successful relationships that there's a webinar about. In fact, it's our most listened and watched webinar. We also have a blog about it. It's related to that. But the first one, of course, is to listen without judgment, without putting your feelings back on them, that you manage your feelings. It's not that you don't feel them. I have to say this because I always get asked this. It's not that you don't feel anything. You just don't hand it over to them. It's not their responsibility to make you happy, to make you feel a sense of serenity. Your serenity is your responsibility. So you go to another place to take care of that. A friend, a spouse, a mentor, a sponsor, a therapist, a 12-step support group, a support group related to the issue specifically, whatever. That's the place you go to feel okay, so that you can continue to come back in your role as a parent, as a loved one, and be there for them in the way that they need. You get your needs taken care of, but in the parent-child relationship specifically, as it relates to substance use and mental health, you won't get that, can't get that, perhaps maybe ought not to even try to get that from the child. You get that need met somewhere else. Very important. Because when I talk about being able to listen to things, people first of all hear me saying, don't feel upset. But second of all, they sometimes hear me saying, repress the hurt. If my child comes at me and says, I'm angry at you, I hate you, you're a bad parent, whatever it is, and they're not going to be that overt about it sometimes, although sometimes they are. I'm not saying take your hurt and your anger and press it down and ignore it. I'm actually saying when you have these new ears and new eyes to see and hear with, it doesn't hurt anymore. So that when a child says something to you, you don't hear it as being even about you. You hear it teaching you something about them and their world, and you don't take it personally. And it just happens, right? That's what you develop as you develop this capacity. You hear it differently. Just like, and it's different. I mean, if your child says something to you and something to me, because since I'm not their father, I have an advantage. I'm much less likely to be affected by it, and much more likely to use that statement, whatever it is, even if it's a harsh one, to find out about them, to find out what's going on for them. Versus kind of the narcissistic way of dealing with it, which is, oh, well, that's about me. I need to argue, defend myself, shut it down. I mean, most of us think about shutting it down. And by the way, if you can only tolerate so much, you get to decide what your level of tolerance is. I was telling this story recently, a few months ago. My wife and I on a Saturday, something came up, and she wanted to share some feelings about me with me. And I remember being really feeling full emotionally at that point in my day. And I remember thinking, I'm going to do this really well. And she started sharing frustrations, whatever it was. Can't remember what it was. And I remember listening to it, and after about 5 minutes, my patience started to wane. And I remember thinking to myself, man, you were feeling really arrogant, really cocky going into this. And look how quickly your emotional resources were spent. And so we're allowed to say, I can't do this anymore. I have to go somewhere. That's really what number 8 is about. I have to go somewhere else, take some space, some time, talk to somebody, journal, just breathe, whatever it is that you do to feel okay. I have to do that so that I can come back and be there for you. My mother-in-law, she's a retired school teacher of many, many years. And she had read my book. This is sometimes last year. And she said, I think it would be great if you could go to schools to teach about today's youth, to teach the teachers what they need to know about today's youth. And I said, what I would teach them to do is to listen. Because if they could listen, they would find out everything they need to know from the children themselves. But they would have to have different ears to do that. They would have to hear rap music, for example, not as a morally despicable expression, but as an expression of feeling powerless, of feeling scared, of trying to survive in a world that doesn't feel safe, right? If they could learn to hear it like that, they would have a completely different response to it. If we could see our children's substance use as a feeling of not feeling okay, feeling disconnected, alienated, powerless, hurt, sad, we have a different response to it than if we think of it as a right or a wrong choice. Learning to empathize. I gave that example, that my favorite example of creating this vacuum of information is when your child has a peer pressure response. Share how you worry about what people think about you. Don't give the solved, polished, finished example. Talk about how you all still struggle with it sometime. When they talk about self-medicating, talk about your self-medicating. When they have failures and struggles, talk about when you fail to reach some of your goals or backslide in some area. They don't want to be the only one that's sick. They don't want to be the only one without answers. It's empowering, it's uplifting to know that other people that they love, especially you all, have problems too. Makes them feel safe. Makes them much more likely to participate and to open up. And isn't that what you want? Don't you want to become a resource for your child? But so many of the things that we do contribute to just the opposite. That we're not safe. That we're not the one to go to be heard, to be offered this kind of acceptance that comes through empathic listening. Asking or stating the intention, I talk about this in the 8 tips webinar very clearly. It's saying to the other person, this is what I want to share something with you. Can you just listen? Can you do this for me? I'm going to ask you what I want from you. Or if you're on the receiving end, I think of all the skills that I ever talk about and teach, this is the most underutilized skill. I mean, a lot of them could be used a lot more by a lot of us, a lot of the time. But this one is just rare. I don't hear people talk about it, but it's simply to say, what would you like from me? After somebody tells you something, they're angry at you, they're frustrated, they're sad, they're scared, they're having a struggle at school, at work, with a boyfriend, with a girlfriend, whatever it is. Before you start with your guess, your best guess, before you jump to that and start responding with a lecture or feedback or a pep talk or whatever, pause and say, thanks for telling me. I'm glad you're talking about, is there anything you need from me in this? Or you just want me to hear it? Just listen. If we could do that consistently, much more often, we would not get into the problems that we get into. It's so basic, but so uncommon. And that really does, in the context of the question that the parents were asking me about on Wednesday night, how can I be there for my child in a way that can support them? This is a key tool. Now, people might ask you for things that you can't or don't want to do. You have a right to say that. See, that makes it clear. And you can say, I'm not sure I can be helpful in this situation. Avoiding imperatives. I think this one is fantastic when we take out the words good, bad, right, wrong, have to, need to, should, ought to, evil. When we take those words out of our vocabulary in the context of talking in relationships, we start to talk from a place of self. I feel, I think, I believe. This is my experience. We stop being the expert and we start being connected. We stop taking a position of the guru versus the novice, and we start seeing eye to eye. And emotionally, even with our children, that can be helpful. I'm not talking about the fact that you do or don't get to choose what goes on in your house. That is still there. You get to make decisions with your children in your home, under the age of 18 with your children, and in your home beyond that. But there's an emotional equality, right? There's an emotional, like, I'm a self, you're a self. Both of those things can be honored, and I get to decide what I'm willing to do, how I'm willing to participate in this relationship. So you learn to talk. I've told the story about the father who was trying to write a letter in reaction to his son, to a difficult time that his son was having in my group, and he was kind of going over it on the phone with me, and he couldn't finish the sentence. And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I'm just struggling to write in a way, to communicate in a way that doesn't have some of those imperatives that I want to use." And I paused and I said, "That's great. It's fantastic. You're learning to think." The tool, the practice of this tool is teaching you to think about really what the relationship is like. And we don't do that naturally. Avoiding polarizations, and the research that shows that families who identify themselves as successful 2 years post-treatment say that avoiding all or nothing language. This always happens. This never happens. You're always this way. This is the worst, those exaggerated phrases. That avoiding those is one of the things they identified. The most common thing that they identified is something that they've adopted. And then avoiding advice. I give the David Bowie example because everybody knows him. He's also famous for his recovery from drugs, where he was asked the question in a BBC interview, asked the question about his drug use and his recovery, and couldn't he just have one drink? And he said, "For me, it wouldn't work. It would kill me. I know that it would be the death of me." And he said something very powerful in that interview too, besides this principle, but I'll add it on. Besides just talking about from his own experience, which is a great way to talk to other people, is like, I don't know if this works for you, but for me, this is how I've learned to deal with it. For me. And in a 45-second interview, he said, "For me," or in my experience, half a dozen times at least. But then he went on to further in the interview and say, the connections in my life and the relationships that have been restored and healed during my sobriety, during my recovery, are so important to me. It's nearly impossible to have healthy relationships for me when I'm using, at least in my experience, he said. And I just don't want to give those up, so I'm not going to put those at risk. Again, he's juxtaposing connection with addiction. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Learning to own your feelings, being responsible, is the famous story that I tell, the one that I tell often, I should say, is when the young girl who had a very, very difficult past with substance use, abuse, sexual acting out, stealing, all kinds of behaviors, violence, aggression toward her family. After reading 3 letters from her family about those and crying, tears coming down her face, her nose running, just absolutely feeling this kind of deep pain. And one of her peers in the group asked her after a moment, "Can you tell us what you're feeling?" And she said, I feel so bad for all the things I put my parents through. And my response was, I think that's true, but I think that's the least important thing in these letters. And the problem with it being about hurting somebody else is that's only going to last until the next time they really get under your skin and piss you off. Right? It's not a sustainable driving force for being healthy. The sustainable driving force is its own reward, right? Virtue is its own reward. Love is the reward of loving, right? Doing and being healthy and being in this life in a healthy, positive, spiritual, emotionally rich way, being kind to others, being gentle with the world, all of those things, they all provide their own reward. So it's not about them being responsible for your feelings. So when you're upset, when you're frustrated, when you're sad, when you're scared, you just own it. I got to deal with this. This is what I'm feeling. Yes, I'm worried about what's going on. You're using heroin, or you haven't been to school a month, of course. But that's my responsibility to work out. Now, here's my boundary. You can still set boundaries. But to dump on, to give them over to the child, to make the child responsible for it, and in essence to suggest that the problem is that I'm feeling upset, and the solution is that you need to change your behavior, wires them for peer pressure. It wires them to believe they're responsible for other people's behavior, or other people's feelings. And you don't want to do that. So owning your feelings, developing a dialogue and a sensibility in that way, and then taking the time that you need to, going to where you need to go when you can't do all of these things, when you stumble, and we all will all the time. So then going to a place where you get fed. I've read this quote many times, but it may be one of my favorite quotes in relationship to what we're talking about. People talk about love all the time. My parents love me, love my kids, the spouse love. My response, if you're just describing a feeling of warmth or affection towards somebody, it's not that important. People that abuse people often express love verbally. But if we think of love as an action, as a thing that we do, then it's a very courageous, very heroic thing. It's you showing up on the webinar. It's you going to Al-Anon. It's you going to Codependent Anonymous. It's you going to family therapy to treat this issue, which is a family issue, right? Everybody that I know, that I respect, who treats substance abuse disorder, sees it as a symptom of a family issue, around feelings often, around relationships. And so the courageous thing that you do is you take on your own journey and you go into it. Gandhi said it this way: a coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave. Projection, fusion, going home is easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic. If we really love the other as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility for our own individuation, our own journey. This heroism may properly be called love. That's what the courageous do. They get into it. They don't keep the problem at arm's distance. They have enough courage, they have enough willingness to battle their own guilt and shame to say, I'm going to look at my part in this. I might have a part in this, and I'm going to look at that. I'm not going to shrink from it. I'm not going to fight against that idea. I'm not going to beat myself up over it so I become completely impotent. But I'm actually going to participate in it. And that takes courage, because we've grown up with guilt and shame. We've grown up with this idea that if we show up in a relationship in a way that's harmful, then we're bad, and that we should feel bad about ourselves, instead of saying, okay, I did that thing, right? We didn't grow up in a culture, in a context, if we struggle with this. We didn't grow up knowing that we just are human. And sometimes we do very human things. Take home. Wilderness is a metaphor for going to a place to find yourself, right? To the community I was speaking to last night, we were talking about Moses being the first therapist. And this was a Jewish community, so the Jewish community having wandered in the wilderness. And it wasn't about the destination. It was about finding, developing a sense of identity and who they are. And that's what happens in wilderness. It becomes a literal and metaphorical journey toward self, toward greater and improved enlightenment. And sending your child to wilderness therapy, yes, we will take on the task, the request that you have to help your child. That's what we do. And as part of that, we're going to come back to you and have webinars and parent groups and parent workshops and parent assignments. And if you'll accept it, and I assume the people who show up on these webinars have accepted it somewhat. And then you should know that there are some families who don't show up on any webinars, ever. But the ones who do have taken on, like Gandhi says, their own individuation. They have begun the journey to love the other as other and to separate out other from self and taking on the hero's journey, the call that I talk about that my entire book is based on. The best thing that we can do to help our children is to find them. To do that, we have to find ourselves first. Because if we don't find ourselves, know ourselves in a greater way than we do today, if we don't know ourselves more, we won't be able to know our children. We can only know our children to the extent that we know ourselves. In the book that we talk about, that I've shared a webinar with, The Knight in Rusty Armor, at one point Merlin, visiting the knight, anticipated the knight's questions. And the knight said, what, do you read minds too? And Merlin said it simply, no, just because I know myself so well, I know you. In my own work as a therapist, I talk about this all the time. My greatest asset, whatever asset I have as a therapist, comes principally from my own personal work. That's why I tell therapists. My cab driver last week was asking me, is it true that all therapists need therapy? And I said, only the good ones. I wouldn't go to a therapist who hadn't committed a large part of their life and practice to doing their own work. Wouldn't be able to trust them. It would show up in their work. I'd be able to see it now. So we do our work. As parents, as therapists, we do our work in order to know the other. We look and we find ourselves. We explore our own history, our own contexts, so we can see the other. I'll say a little bit about, and I recommend to you, all of you, to go to the internet and type in TED Talk on Addiction and Connection, or Rat Park, RATPARK. I won't elucidate the entire talk to you right now, but essentially it is this challenge that what we know and think about addiction isn't all true. That we learned from the early rat studies in the 1970s, contrasted with the ones that came later in the 80s and 90s. We know that rats that were exposed and given opportunities to do fun things, to have family, to have other rats, that they did not get addicted to the drug-laced water that they were provided. Nearly none of them overdosed. Whereas the rats, who were just put in a cage in the 1970s, and were given two different waters, one pure water and one laced with heroin or cocaine, almost always killed themselves. So he basically says this is a cage problem. He talked about the Vietnam veterans that came home. 20% of Vietnam veterans came home physiologically addicted to heroin. 95% of those that came home got clean and sober without any formal treatment once they got reconnected to their lives. Okay? So he posits, the thesis is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. That it's not about the hooks of the drug. That can create a physiological addiction. But the true addiction is about the lack of connection. And that's why he challenges some simple notions about what we do in addiction, what we do in our society. He talks about Portugal and how they've decriminalized all drugs, from marijuana to crack cocaine, he says. And how their drug rate has dropped dramatically. Drug abuse, drug addiction rate has dropped dramatically. And it wasn't because they introduced a lot of therapy, but they created a place for people that were struggling to be reconnected to society through supporting the jobs, taking all the money that they were using in the criminal system and incentivizing employers to give addicts jobs, give them a chance. So it's a good TED Talk. Take 15 minutes and listen to it. It's fantastic. Skills can lead you to insight. Practice the skills. I'll go back to the imperatives, asking and stating the intention. If you haven't watched the 8 Tools webinar, watch it, listen to the podcast. It's just practice these things. And when you practice them, you'll find yourself thinking and relating to people in a different way. And then lastly, again, it's not a one line. It's not what you say. I was having some colleagues was getting a referral. This was some time ago. And the colleague was saying, what are you going to say to them? What are you going to tell them? And I said, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to say to them. I know what I know. I know who I am. I'm going to have a conversation with them. And the conversation is going to be ideally an invitation to them to share as much as they're willing to with me. And for me then to hold it with love and patience and compassion. And then that's where the healing is. That's how we heal. That's how we experience a sense of well-being and heal ourselves, essentially. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions on topic before I go over our upcoming events and announcements. Is the goal for the kid to stop the use? Love, sharing, and listening do not necessarily stop the addiction. Yeah, the goal is for them to... Stopping the use is the symptom, but the goal is to give them a sense of well-being, a sense of okayness. And then if they need 12-step, they go to 12-step and find that support, that structure, that culture, that identity there. They get a sponsor. Right? They can do other forms of recovery if those work for them. But all of those things, all that we do in treatment, you could go to 100 different treatment centers in the United States, all different types of models, and they would talk about feelings and talk about listening. So that's the foundation of recovery. People in recovery don't even crosstalk. They don't do group therapy activities. People in 12-step meetings in recovery, they go in and tell their story. And the most beautiful thing happens. People just listen. And for some reason, some crazy reason, 12-step work, 12-step programming is saving hundreds of thousands of lives. So yeah, we believe that there's that there's a link that can't be broken between talking about feelings, being in relationship with other people, being heard, and sobriety, and not using, and not having symptoms. We believe that about other mental health issues too. So yeah, it's the goal. But this stuff becomes the water that we swim in, right? The context of it all. Fear doesn't work. Simple refusal skills doesn't work. Intimidation, threats don't work. The war on drugs isn't working, right? So we're trying to create a different mentality around it. Even some recent things in our own government and in other countries, they begin to decriminalize some drug use and just provide a safe place for people to be safe. But yeah, that's the ultimate goal. Do you think when you share past drug or alcohol experiences with your child, it gives them the go-ahead to try it for themselves? I believe my child thinks since mom and dad did this, I can too without getting into trouble. For me, I don't. I don't think it does anything. My children, all four of my children, have known about my substance abuse issues as a teenager and the problems I got into. It just was a natural. I don't even remember the moment. It's just a part of my upbringing, part of my discussion. Because of what I do for a living, it comes out. And even when my oldest struggled with substance abuse, I guess my clearest answer to this is it didn't matter to me if he used it as an excuse. I didn't care. If he did, and he never did, I never heard him, it wouldn't have mattered. I would have said, I don't care. Just because I ran a car into a wall when I was being reckless doesn't mean that your reckless driving is going to be an excuse. It's not even part of the equation. So, and then my other children, they're not all old enough yet, but I have another old one, never experimented to any degree whatsoever with alcohol and drugs, and and it's not a problem. And so I don't have the experience that that's what it does at all. And I have a lot of friends in recovery who because of what they do for a living and because they're outspoken in recovery, their children know about it, and it's not my experience. I think it becomes this thing that you're talking about it when the parent is trying to be right. When the parent thinks that they need to be right or good in order to enforce a rule. It's more about the parent's triggers. It's more about the parent's Achilles heel than it is about the child. And so when it doesn't become something I would even respond to if my child did use it, then they don't use it. It's like when I talk about parents writing letters of accountability to their children, and so many parents have told me, I'm afraid they'll use it against me. And my response is, it's impossible to use it against you if you don't let them. If I come to you and apologize and make an amends to you out of a sense of responsibility and accountability and love for you, you can't use it against me because I don't need anything from you. I'm telling it to you as a gift. So you can throw it in the garbage, you can throw it back in my face, you can do whatever, but I don't take that on. How do you integrate all the aftercares that our kids are sent off to after wilderness and this connection that is lost when we send them away? Are we just not ready to receive our children? Are we cheating ourselves by not bringing them home and doing our work more directly with them present? Great question, fair question. First of all, I'm going to go out of this for a second. You can bring me back to it, Stephanie. This is what we're doing initially. This is what we're doing with acute care. We are getting everybody in the family to do this thing, to work on themselves. The foundation to connection, I'll say this very clearly, the foundation, the first ingredient in connection and in intimacy is selves that are well developed. And we can do that with practice through the treatment process. And if you do this, you can become more connected to your child even while they're away than you can when you're in the same soup as they are when they're at home. So it's really about developing a greater self, practicing some communication, and that distance actually creates a better context for healthy connection. And then you practice it going forward. But connection is not defined by proximity, by physical proximity. Connection can happen. My son or daughter can live in Washington, D.C., and I can live in Los Angeles, and I can be connected to them, right? And they can be in my house, and we can be emotionally a million miles away from each other. Most likely because of my over-identification, over-involvement with them, right? Because I can't separate them and me, and all that implies. So that's why these models work in this way. And one of the founders of family therapy never did sessions with two family members in the same room at the same time. And he is considered one of the 4 or 5 most significant contributors to family therapy. His name is Murray Bowen, and he lived in Washington, D.C. And he never did. Even though he's a family therapist, he never did sessions with 2 people in the same room. It's about a way of thinking and being, really. How do you integrate the aftercares that our kids went to? All right, I just answered that. Thank you. What do you do when your child binge drinks for the first time? How do you handle that? You talk to them. You become involved. Like that's one of those questions is you talk about it. You know, that's the first thing is you have a discussion about it. Maybe go talk to an expert. Maybe talk to your therapist. Maybe you go to your first Al-Anon meeting. And you see, all the therapy and the Al-Anon meetings, they teach you how to be in relationship to somebody who does self-destructive things. And if this one-time thing is a aberration, it will show up that way. But if it develops over time, then there'll be more things that you'll have to do around that. But you talk about it and you do your work. That's what you do. You go to Al-Anon, you go to a therapist, You talk to your child and you talk about it and you listen and you become involved in a way. And you learn, I'll say this very clearly, you learn how to be in relationship with somebody that you love who's doing self-destructive things. That's a really important skill to learn. All right. Let's go for upcoming, and then we'll close it up. If there are any more questions, you can submit them. Okay, we have upcoming workshops. The next workshop that we would like all current families to go to if they can is, excuse me, is January 28th and 29th at Entrada. Talk to your therapist. Email Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. The Finding You on January 15th is full. The next Finding You, it will be in Park City on February 19th. We have a few people already to that, so if you want to go, that's where we do deep, immersive work with 6 adults. Those are the ones that I leave. And then we have a Finding Family one in Park City, March 19th through 22nd. To learn more about it, you can go to our website, call admissions, or email intensives at evoketherapy.com. We want all parents to go to 6 12-step support group meetings while their child is with us. Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, Naranon.org, Alanon.alateen.org are all programs that you can go to. You can go to those websites and find groups in your area, meeting times in your area. You can also go to NAMI.org to find free resources, classes, affordable resources in your area. Next support groups we have listed will be in Los Angeles on the afternoon of the 29th, 4 o'clock potluck, followed by a 5 to 7 meeting. Bay Area, January 31st, 7 to 9 p.m., San Mateo Marriott, San Francisco Airport. Email Stephanie at evoketherapy.com to RSVP or for more information. Please, if you would like to listen to any of these webinars on podcasts, we are converting them all to podcasts. You can go to the podcast app on your iPhone, iPod, iOS device and search Evoke Therapy programs, or on Android devices, you can go to the SoundCloud app, download that, and search Evoke Therapy programs. Follow us on social media, Twitter and Instagram, Facebook. The Foundation alumni page is a place you can go to connect with other alumni and also to provide support for people who can't afford therapy. And our blog. Pursuits is our adventure trips for therapy light, sober fun, family adventure. So it's therapy light and good sober fun. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on paperback and also Audible or for CD purchase. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page to buy books on Amazon that have been recommended by our therapists, and that also a percentage of those proceeds go to help people who can't afford therapy. Any last questions before I wrap up? Some parents accept kids in their home to keep them safe to experiment with alcohol or pot. What is your take on that? Don't ask, don't tell. Is that okay? I'm not a fan of this kind of thing. I mean, if my son or daughter were in crisis, I would rather them be safe than anything. But to invite or to condone young children using alcohol or drugs just so that they're safe, I don't think that's effective. And the research shows that the earlier on that a child is introduced to drugs and alcohol, the more likely they are to suffer from addiction later in life. The research is clear. The brain gets wired for addiction. So that's why the age of 21 for alcohol introduction and most likely for no other drugs is an important age. The more mature the brain is, the later that a child experiments with it, the better. So I would still think of children underage using anything as a significant risk contribution to developing addictions later in life, and the research would bear that out. But I'll say this though, it's too complex of an issue to just have a zero tolerance, meaning that there's some gray area. I think the way that I've heard it said best is the position is I can't have this in my home. Like, this is not going to be okay for you to be using drugs or alcohol in my home. But not a black and white thing. It's a discussion, it's dialogue. Even when a child relapses in treatment on a home visit or if they're an adult when they relapse in the program. Very few programs. These are drug rehabilitation programs. Very few programs have a zero tolerance. They see how the person responds to it. They have a conversation, a process around it, and many of those people are allowed to stay in treatment. Some aren't because of the way they respond to the process. So it's a process, and the ultimate line is I can't live with it, can't support it, and so we're going to talk about it. We're going to have a process around it. It's one thing to learn how to live with someone who is self-destructive as an adult, but what about a 14-year-old? The drug use cannot be tolerated by me due to his age and all the negative effects. Absolutely. This webinar has not been about not having that boundary. That's a reasonable boundary I would encourage any parent to have. So you do treatment, you go to Al-Anon, you figure out a way, you fight the fight. It's a worthwhile battle to fight. And just condoning it, just allowing it to happen, that's not what any of this is about. It's about learning how to respond to it in a way that's helpful, which can and often does involve intervention or several different levels of intervention, depending upon the resources that you have, depending upon how severe it is, all of that. Talk to experts, even though those experts are non-paid people like your sponsor at Al-Anon. Talk to them. Learn how to respond to this. So yes, I'm not saying don't respond or don't hold a boundary. Not at all. I wouldn't tolerate it either. But I also wouldn't treat everything like a nail. For me, learning how to respond to it in dialogue was an important part of my own fathering with my son. Will your podcast have your question answer portion? Yes. They have everything. I just cut out some of the quiet moments, and I cut out if there's some mistakes or errors, but other than that, it has everything. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for moderating. That hour went by quickly for me. That is not the next webinar. It is not the object of therapy. I don't know how that ended up there, actually. It is going to be, the next webinar will be this Wednesday, 2 nights from now at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, and I don't remember the title that I chose. Maybe that's why the old one is up there. So we'll send out that announcement tomorrow. Have a great evening. Thank you for joining us. Hope these points of contact are helpful, whether you're watching the webinar or listening to them on a podcast. I hope it's helpful. Have a great evening. Take care. Bye-bye.